Hello, thanks for joining me on my channel. I'm Christopher Donald, and the demo today is going to be doing slab coil. A lot of people have done slab building, a lot of people have done coil building. This is kind of bringing those two worlds together and making a little mashup of the two. Uh, Coil slab is particularly good for making forms a little bit larger, a little bit faster. One downside with coil building is though it's very, very flexible. It takes some more time to actually put all those coils together. You have a lot of seams, and coil slab is going to give you fewer seams, a little bit better compression, and just more speed. So first off, when we're hand building, we're mostly going to be doing ram's head wedging. Ram's head wedging is where I'm using both hands, and I'm squeezing a little bit from the outside as I push down, and you should end up with something that basically does have like horns on the side, sort of like a sheep's snout. It could basically look like a ram's head. All right. And the reason why we're going to wedge this way is that it's going to give us a more, a sturdier cross-section of grain. Clay particles are flat, and when you get the clay fresh out of the bag, it's basically those flat particles kind of floating in every direction. There's no real grain direction to the particles. You haven't compressed them in any specific direction. And you can use the clay directly out of the bag, but there's no advantages to it. If you wedge it in ram's head, I've got two spiral points and a center compression. And then when I compress it down on end, like this, those are going to all overlap, and it's going to be like plywood. And since I'm essentially rolling out very narrow slabs, I want this kind of strength and compression when I go to roll out the clay. So I know that I want these to be longer because I want something that's basically more like a coil. So I'm going to go ahead and start making this more elongated right out at the beginning. And I'm going to be constantly flipping and rotating this and compressing it from both sides. Use your fist. You can use a rubber mallet covered in fabric. And then I'm going to use my rolling pin. Never use your rolling pin as a mallet. Don't do this with it, especially the ones that have rotating handles, steel bearings, and a rod in the middle. If you do this with it and treat it like a mallet, you'll destroy those bearings. It's okay to lean your weight into it, but you shouldn't use it like a hammer. And each time I roll, I'm going to flip it or rotate it. So I'm compressing it from different directions. And give myself a little bit of room here. This guy out of the way. And I want nice long pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and stretch this out as long as I can get it. Now, if you want, you can use rolling sticks, which would be putting a stick on either side of the slab. My rolling pin can bridge those sticks, and that'll give me an even consistency as I'm rolling. It's a nice trick to use, especially when you're going to be building a lot of coils on top of each other. So I'd recommend trying that if you're not confident about your rolling abilities. I'm pretty confident about mine at this point. I'll get it the thickness I want, so not going to bother with them. Okay. Now, if you've got any air bubbles, now's the time to get rid of any of those. Pop them, kind of push that out. And then I can do my strips. I'm going to go ahead and just mark this. And just cut a couple of these. All right. Nope, never have a knife sharp enough to actually cut your ruler. This is a fettling knife. It actually doesn't have a traditionally sharp edge, so it's not going to cut you. It's not going to cut the canvas. Shouldn't have cut my arguably very cheap ruler. And this is the kind of blade that you want to use when you're doing ceramics. Butter knives are as sharp as you really need. Often people will use a pin tool, but I don't like the way that a round tool will drift through the clay sometimes. So I find that I can get straighter cuts using an actual flat blade. Up to you though. This one is made out of an old steak knife. Repurposing is a really great way to go when you're in the arts. 10-cent steak knife and a little bit of time with an angle grinder, and you got a good tool. All right, I'll take my extra clay material. Always ball this up in between working on it. That way it's not going to dry out too much. I've got a fan on, and this clay is going to dry pretty quick if I'm not careful about keeping it balled up. And if I'm not using it at all, it goes back into the bag. A lot less recycling for me later. Save me some time. Right, so I've got my strips ready here. And I have a slab that I rolled out earlier. This is going to be the base for the piece that I'm doing. And I like to keep these at about the same moisture level if I can. So this is still flexible. And especially for attaching the first layer to this, that's going to really help. For subsequent layers, I could let the first ones dry a little bit, get to early leather hard, so they can support the next layer a little bit better. But this is fine for beginning. Right, let me grab my other tools here. Okay. This is how every artist does organize their tools, even though we swear to ourselves that we're not going to throw them in a bucket next time. Just end up with 6 buckets full of tools and a nice empty tackle box. All right. First thing I want to do is compress this slab that I rolled and trimmed. That's going to be the bottom of my piece. I'm using a metal rib for that because with a metal rib, I can use that thin edge and put a lot more force without really having to push down on the clay and stretch it out very much. I want to compress the surface. I don't want to kind of manhandle the clay and deform the shape all that much. The side effect of this process is that I am smoothing. The purpose of this process is that I am compressing. So the smoothing is a side effect, basically, of compression. You can also use a rubber rib, but this is a little soft for a rubber rib, I feel. If it's this soft, this is probably going to dig in a little bit more than the metal rib will. And then the other thing I'm going to need is a small container of water. All right, I'm back with my container of water here. And I have a scratching tool. This is called a Valentine scratcher. It's actually made with guitar strings. And so it's flexible spring steel. You can score a much broader area really, really quickly. And it doubles as almost a paintbrush. It'll hold water so that when I go to scratch it the second time, especially the more that I use it and the more clay that gets built up on it, I can add some water and rescore this. Now, when you're putting pieces of clay together, you want to be really careful that that connection point is wet and squishy when you press them together. If it's not, stop, rescore, add a little bit more water. Without that squishy liquid connection point, it's not really going to fuse into one piece of clay. They'll stay separate. And that can give you a lot of problems through the drying process. Clay is going to shrink about 9% from wet to dry. So if I don't have a really good connection here on that seam, it's going to want to shrink and come apart on me. If there is a good connection, it will fight that a little bit and it should stay together. It's also the reason why I want my bottom clay for the foot to be about the same moisture content as the walls that I'm putting on. If I were to let the floor dry out to, say, medium or late leather hard, and then I attached a wet piece to it, this clay would actually be larger than this clay, and this would shrink far more than this. And it would crack and take itself right off. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start attaching this. I'm just going to lay it down nice and gradually. So I'm not really pushing it in at first. I'm not going to press it down until I've already got it all kind of laid on the slab. And then I'm going to go around and I'm kind of pushing and wiggling at the same time. I want to make sure I get a really nice connection there between the two. All right, I've got it even. Now I'll go back one more time and kind of push and wiggle. Just make sure it's even, it's connected correctly, it's squished in there. There you go. Okay. Now, obviously, it didn't go all the way around. I'm going to take another one of these. I'm going to overlap them. And then I'm going to cut through both layers at the same time at a 45-degree angle. Being careful not to cut straight through the foot. Now I've got that piece. I have not scored this second piece yet. I'm going to wait until I've got it so that I know it's overlapped correctly. If you overlap them when you cut through like this, it's like cutting a pumpkin lid. It doesn't matter if your cut is straight or not, it will line up. So nice little trick. Easier than measuring. Now I'll score these sides. I'm going to rescore this flat spot and add a little more water. It's been sitting for a minute and it might have already absorbed that water and dried out. And the last thing I want is a dry, not mushy connection as I put those two pieces together. Now I'm going to score this new coil slab and score its ends. All right, here we go. Again, get that in place. And then I'm going to carefully press and wiggle. I don't want to push too hard or squeeze too hard because the clay is soft enough that I can deform it. And I don't want to have to kind of fix a lot of things later on. All right, there we go. So that's as much as I'm going to want to really touch that layer. And now I can do the next layer. Now for this one, I'm going to want to overlap these two seams from putting in this short piece. And I'll make sure that my seams don't all line up. I don't really want a whole row of seams going up the wall. So kind of like building a brick wall. Have your seam from the previous one go into the middle of one that doesn't have a seam. So you can see just with one coil, one slab coil, I'm already up 2 inches here. All right, do not rush the scoring. You can also use a paintbrush to put the water on. That's another good trick. And sometimes people will make their scoring tool so that one end is a paintbrush and the other end is your scorer. I've seen that done with forks. Flatten a fork out and you can put a sponge on or a brush on one end. I'm going to be doing a video on making this scoring tool. I have to make some for my students, and so I'll video that process. No reason to be secretive about these. It's a fantastic tool. I didn't come up with it. Happy to share. All right. So I'm going to get this lined up on there. Okay, and again, lining it up before I really start doing the pressing and wiggling too much. I don't want to take forever because this is drying out and the two sections are sticking together. Now this is going to be a little bit trickier because that first section is still a little bit damp. I don't want to push so hard that I'm going to kind of deform the bottom part. So I might use my other hand to kind of lift the bottom coil slightly as I'm pushing down with my right hand. So left is supporting, right is doing the connecting work. Work my way around. See if we have enough there. It might work. Let's see. Always stretch it a tiny little bit. Usually doesn't hurt anything. And I don't have a lot of extra here, so I'm going to overlap. Actually, I'm not going to overlap this one at all. I've already got a 45-degree cut here. So I'll cut a matching 45 on this side. Save myself that little bit of extra clay. Get this one lined up and only overlap this end. There you go, don't cut too deep. Make sure I score this piece. Absolutely never forgotten to score a piece and had part of the wall fall off later. Everybody does it. It's fine. Getting better to craft is all about recovering from your mistakes faster. Okay, get that lined up. Getting it connected to the first course. All right, and there we go. Now, the temptation is to want to keep working on this and fussing with it and getting it just right. I'm looking down at the shape from the top, and I am making it even, and I am going to make no attempt to clean up the seam at this point. I'm going to want to let this actually stiffen up. Now, while it's this soft, this isn't necessarily a terrible time to put a coil in the inside, but honestly, I think I would probably wait until it's more early leather hard, and then I would score inside the bottom seam here, add a small coil. It'll speed up the finishing process quite a bit to just put a little bit of a coil in there. I don't need a coil for these seams along the wall. When I'm all done, I'm going to use a surform, which is a rasp. Looks like this. And I'll use this to clean up the rough on here and then scrape it with a metal rib. And then I'll use a rubber rib to remove the marks from the metal rib. You kind of treat it like as if you're making something out of lumber. You don't go from a log to a finished table in one step. And there's a big temptation for beginning students especially to kind of want to just do everything at one stage. Like, you've got it, I'm just going to keep working on it until I destroy it. It's not really a great way to approach it. We will come back in, we'll do a little fade away here, and I will show you finishing this piece once it's dried out a little bit. All right, be back soon. All right, welcome back. If you're joining me after having watched the first video, this is part 2 of doing a coil slab built piece, and this is essentially just going to be about the finishing. About how are we going to actually finish this off? I described it in the previous video, but it's going to be more helpful if you actually can get a look at that process itself. Since making this earlier, it's been about an hour. I let it dry underneath the ceiling fan. And at this point, I'd call it medium leather hard. I can still deform it a little bit, but it's more difficult to do. And what I'm going to want to do with this first off is clean up this bottom edge, this seam between the walls, the coils, and the floor. To do that, I'm going to use a surform. It's actually spelled S-U-R-F-O-R-M for surface former. Sometimes people call it a surform. But a surform is a rasp, and this is going to allow me to really evenly and easily shave off that excess clay on this bottom seam and make it so that it lines up perfectly with the wall. And while I'm doing that, I can also use the surform to clean up the middle seam a little bit. So I can kind of get both. I'm only going to take off the high points with this. I'm not going to try and shave down into the wall a whole bunch. I didn't leave that much extra clay. I left, I'd say, maybe a 1/16 of an inch more than I really need in this wall. So I can take off some of the inconsistencies, but I can't really go hog wild with it. If I'd left a slightly thicker wall, I could do that. I could just shave the whole thing even if I wanted. But in this case, it's pretty straight, and I'm just more or less taking off that little bit of extra that's left from me pushing against the seam where it kind of bulges out slightly. Okay, now one point to mention at this moment about shavings, so you do want to be a little bit careful about letting these fall on the floor and dry out. An issue with these tiny little pieces is that they dry really quick. And if they get on the floor and they dry out real fast, you walk on them, crush them up. That's how you get dust. That makes for an unhealthy environment. When I'm all done, I'm actually going to vacuum, get rid of any of the ones that might fall on the floor. So I clean that up a little bit. The next thing I'll want to do is actually bevel this bottom edge. At clay makers where I work, they won't fire a piece unless 1/4 inch is left unglazed. And you could leave that 1/4 inch in the wall. So I could say just leave a 1/4 inch of the wall unglazed. But if I do that, it's not going to be a very elegant solution. Um, it's pretty rough and ready if you're just leaving part of the wall unglazed. Now, if I put a bevel, a 1/4 inch bevel in the bottom of this, it's going to do a couple things for me. One, it's going to make it so that I have a 1/4 inch I can leave unglazed, and then that is going to make it good for firing. And the other thing is that that 1/4 inch is going to give the piece some lift from the tabletop. You're going to get a little shadow line underneath it, and it separates it from the surface that it's sitting on. So it does more than simply just give me a logical end place for the glaze. It's also a really nice finishing detail. Before I keep this flipped over, I'm going to get the rest of this cleaned up. And to do that, I'll look around for my materials, which are always usually with something on top of them. I bet I laid it right down. Yep, there we go. Okay. One of these days I'll paint everything I own yellow. I might be able to find things. To finish this bevel off, I'm going to use a soft rubber rib. And I'm using a soft one because I want to just kind of help round off that hard edge and remove the marks from the surform, but I don't really want to press into the clay very, very hard and reshape the clay at this stage. So a nice soft rubber rib like a Cheryl Red is going to work really good. There's multiple rib manufacturers. The two big ones are Michael Cheryl and Kemper Tools. Kemper, their softer rib is a blue. They have a blue and a black rib. And Michael Cheryl, I believe his softest is the red rib, which I tend to use as a substitute for my fingers. That's the other thing you could do is you can just use your fingers for this to round that off. So I've got that all nice and cleaned up. And this would be my moment if I want to sign my work before I completely forget about it. I've got a small metal stamp, actually thought to wash, so it's wet. And I'll just stamp my name on the bottom. I'm all good now. Okay, clean this up so I'm not getting little crumbs stuck on the bottom. I flip it over. Now I'm going to make sure that this top shape is what I want, and I can use the surform or here we go. Or I can use a larger surform. It's come in a lot of different iterations. So I've got, this is just like a basic smaller one. There's a larger flat one. So you want a Michael Cheryl's. Not like the guy needs any more people talking up his tools, but that's one of Michael Cheryl's. I guess are 15, $3. This is like eight or 10. And they actually come even bigger than this. They're generally used for like plastic work and woodworking, but they work great for ceramics. So if I need to flatten an area, this bigger, flatter one is going to work really good. If I'm trying to even out this lip a little bit, maybe as I was pinch connecting this, I maybe made parts of it a tiny little bit higher than other parts. And a bigger rasp is going to be a little bit better for kind of evening that out. There we go, nice and quick. Right tool for the job. Then I can use this smaller one, take a little bit off of the edge. There we go. Okay, so I've got that. All right, this inside edge, where the tool fits, I can use the Surform. Where it doesn't fit, I will use a metal rib as a scraper. Just clean that edge off here. There we go. And I've got a couple of small seams on the inside here. I'll also clean those with the scraper, with the metal rib. Nice and cleaned off. There we go. So I'm doing the small vertical ones first. Then I'll come back and scrape the longer ones that go all the way around. Front and back. All right, so you're thinking to yourself, what if I don't want there to be any kind of a mark or line on the inside of this pot after all of my hard work? And you could take and carefully fill those marks, or you could continue to scrape until they're gone. I prefer to use a slip, a liquid clay. If I want it to look like I haven't done anything, I can make a liquid clay slip out of this exact same clay body and just pour that inside of it when it's at late leather hard. Pour it out again as if I'm glazing. And then that will coat all of the little issues and blemishes and problems on the inside. Because it's made out of the same clay body, you won't even be able to tell I did it. Nice trick if you want to just clean up a lot of things, especially if it's something like coil building where everything is a seam on the inside. Take you forever to try and clean all that up if you wanted to. Just coat it with a liquid. Okay, take my little bits out. There's a nice thing for this is to have just like a large cheap paintbrush. Will help brush those kinds of little crumbs out of there if you're trying to get them all out. There we go. And now if I want to clean this inside seam, it's okay if you want to put a coil in there. I mean, it's not going to hurt anything. As long as your construction's pretty good, though, you probably don't technically need the coil. So often I just use something that has a little bit of an angle. Even like a dull pencil will kind of get right into that seam. And I just want to make sure it's compressed. So much of this looks like it's all about smoothing, and it really isn't. My only concern with this seam might be that if I leave a hard edge, then during the glazing, the firing processes, ceramic becomes very glass-like. And hard, sharp edges can make it so that it wants to crack along that line. Just like how you can cut glass by scratching it and putting in a sharp line and then getting that to run and break the glass, that can happen in ceramics when you don't want it to. So I'm just going to compress that a little bit. I don't really think it needed it structurally other than, these two pieces are holding together really well. It's just so that I don't have any issues with any kind of a running crack or stress point or fracture later. Now I'm going to use a rubber rib again, soft rubber rib. I can put a little bit more force, but even if I'm pushing fairly hard, notice I'm still supporting it with my other hand. This is medium leather hard, but I don't want to go pushing it around too much. So I can put a little bit more force on this, get that to kind of smooth out. And because it's a soft rib, it's going to bend into the force. It's not going to kind of put more marks into the lip. It's going to want to even it out. And I'm just going to feather that. I'm working my way down the side against the edge. I can go into the inside here, again, supporting it a little bit so I'm not just pushing the wall all over the place. It's important to do things as wet as you can because if I make a mistake at this point, I can still actually repair this piece. There's some way to recover. I did this too late in the process and I pushed too hard. just going to crack a wall, and that's going to be all she wrote. But have some respect still for the fact that you need to support your piece while you're making changes to it, and you're not muscling it around too much, expecting it to put up with it. All right, almost done. Okay, here we go. I'm going to look from the top again when I'm done and make sure that this shape is exactly the way that I want it. It's still malleable enough that I can tweak it just a little bit, just enough that I can get it where I want. Now, if I want to clean up the walls here, I'm going to use my metal rib, and I'm going to kind of push with the edge of it. So I start pretty flat, and then I bring this up on edge. So I start flat and then come up onto the edge. And doing that is going to allow me to put a little bit more force on the clay. And it's a little easier if I've got it supported here, but it was harder for you to see. So I can smooth all that down, depending on if that's important to me. Really depends on what your intention is for your work. You do a lot of decorating on the outside. You might want to get rid of all the canvas marks. Or like sgraffito, it's nice to get rid of all of these things. So it's perfectly smooth when you put the slip on. But a lot of times when you glaze this, those canvas marks are just going to disappear. You're never even going to see them. So if I feel like there's too many things here before I start smoothing, I can actually turn into the edge of this a little harder and scrape a little bit of the surform marks off of the surface before I smooth. Come back and smooth. It is a subtle difference between the two things. And if you feel like you can't really get it adequately smoothed with your metal rib, switch to a rubber rib. For the side of this, I actually think this red rib is probably too soft. It's not really going to do the job. The different hardnesses are for different things. So, experiment with them. See at which part in your process each color or each stiffness actually works better for you. One tool will not do everything necessarily. And the more you get involved in ceramics, the more giant piles of unnecessary tools you will accumulate. You have huge buckets full of them. You don't know where to put them. But the reason I have so many tools is because I'll have one specific job that requires a specific angle or specific contour. And I then have that tool too. All right, let's see what we got here. I've got another stiffer one. There we go. So the Kemper blue, it's actually an old Kemper blue. That's a little stiffer than the Cheryl red. There we go. And that's just stiff enough that it's wanting to smooth down those surform lines on the outside and the scraping marks and get that finally cleaned up for me. Yeah. This part. Okay. Again, look from the top. You're going to bump it a little bit. It's not going to be absolutely perfect when you're done moving it around that much. And now, all set. All right. Still a little bit of a seam on the inside. Not too concerned about it. Like I said, you can come and smooth that out if you want. Use a hard rubber rib. You can use a wooden tool. You can fill it in with a little bit of clay with a coil, or you can line the whole thing with a little bit of slip later on. That cleans it up good too. All right, thanks for joining me. And I'm going to be doing some other finishing videos. I'll actually have one on trimming wheel thrown pieces and doing thrown feet. And eventually in a little bit, we'll also have a video on doing added feet for handle pieces, but baby steps. All right, see you next time. Thanks for joining me. Bye.